Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from AnthonyMorganti.com. In this video, I'm going to talk about the menu settings that I use with my Fujifilm X-T1 using firmware version 4.0. Now, these settings are specific to that firmware version. If you're not sure what firmware you're using with your Fujifilm X-T1 or X-T10 camera, it's easy enough to check. Just turn the camera off, and on the back of the camera there's a display back button. Hold that button in while turning the camera on, and you'll come up with this display, and you can see that I'm using body version 4.00. If you're using an earlier version, go to the Fujifilm website and download the latest version, and there's instructions there on how to install it. Once you install it, you could then come to this video and watch the menu settings that I use. Now, we're going to start right off with the shooting menu, and I'm going to go relatively quickly because there's a lot of settings. Now, the first thing is bracketing. I've only ever used in my entire life exposure bracketing. So as you enter the bracketing settings, the first thing is the bracket select, and I use the AE bracketing. If I'm shooting HDR, I would use AE bracketing. If you're shooting a tricky lit scene that might have some very bright areas and very dark areas, you might want to bracket so that you get a good, at least one of those exposures will be perfect. So I use AE bracketing. You could also do ISO bracketing, film simulation bracketing. That's whether you're using Profia, Estia, Classic Chrome, stuff like that. Dynamic range bracketing, which I don't do at all, and white balance bracketing. So again, I use exposure bracketing. So now we could change the settings for those different types of brackets we could choose in that first menu item. Again, I only use exposure bracketing, and I bracket one full stop. You could go 2/3 of a stop or 1/3 of a stop, but I bracket one full stop. Again, now you could change your settings for if you're using ISO bracketing, film simulation bracketing, white balance. You could change the settings there. Advanced filter select I don't ever use, but there are some filters installed in the camera that you could get these different effects, like a toy camera effect, a miniature look, pop color, high key, low key, dynamic tone. It also has, selective colors, red, green, blue, whatever. I don't use this at all. I happen to have it set to low key, but again, I will never use that. So that is the bracketing settings. Next is autofocus settings, and this changed considerably with version 4.0 of the firmware. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump down to the AF mode to show you that. There's now 3 different focus modes: single point, zone, and wide tracking. I tend to use all 3 of these, with single point and zone the most. That I use those more than wide tracking. And I have a function button on the back of the camera set so I could quickly jump in and change this if I need to. I have it set to single point right now. We'll go up to the focus area, which is the first menu item in the autofocus setting. And we're going to look, and you can see that I can move this focus point anywhere I want in the frame. And you can see that there's 9 focus points in the center that have a different, like, shaded plus than the other focus points. That's because those focus points use phase detection to achieve focus, and that's a little more accurate and quite a bit faster than the other focus points that are outside of it that use contrast detection. So if possible, you would prefer to keep your focus points somewhere within these 9 focus points in the center. Also, you could change the size of your actual focus point by using the command dial on the back. There's 5 different sizes you could pick. If you use the smallest size, you'll get probably the best focus, but it will take longer to achieve focus. And if you get up to the largest size, it'll achieve focus the fastest, but it might not be the most accurate. And if you hit the focused assist button on the back of the camera, it'll go to the default focus size, which is the 3rd up from the smallest. And that is usually what I keep it at. Now I'm going to go down and I'm going to go to AF mode again, and I'm just going to show you zone focusing real quick. And if we go up to the focus area now, you can see that there's a box, a 5x3 box, and I can move this box around. Anything that is in that zone, that 5x3 zone, the camera will focus on it. So you could have something moving and you're following it with your camera, and when you're half pressing the shutter button, the camera will achieve focus on what is moving within that 5 by 3 grid that is wherever you placed it. Now again, if you keep it in the middle, you'll be using those phase detection focus pixels. So that is probably the best place, if you can, to keep this box. Now again, you could change the size of the box by using the command dial on the back of the camera. You could go to a 5 by 5 or a 3 by 3. And again, if you hold or push in the focus assist button, you'll get the default 5 by 3. I use this quite a bit, and I found that it works really very well. So that is the zone focusing. Now, now it is release focus priority. That's the next choice in the autofocus settings. I have mine set to release for both single and continuous focusing. That means if I'm half pressing in the shutter button to achieve focus and I want to take the picture, but the picture isn't quite perfectly in focus, and I press that shutter button in, it will take the picture. If I had it set to focus, it will only take the picture when it thinks that the subject is in perfect focus. So with the way I have it set, I could take some blurry pictures. If you set it the other way, you may miss some shots altogether because your camera won't take the picture until it's in perfect focus. Now, the reason why I prefer release is because if I'm using a small enough aperture, I may have enough depth of field so that my subject is in adequate focus and I don't have to worry about it. If you have it in focus release or focus, release focus priority, then it will only take the picture when it's in perfect focus. And to tell you the truth, all my cameras I always set to release for both single focus and continual focus. Instant autofocus setting, that means that the AF-L button on the back of the camera, when I hold that in, when I'm in manual mode, I'm in manual focus mode, if I push in that AF-L button on the back of the camera, it will focus even though I'm in manual mode. It will try to autofocus. How do I want it to behave? Do I want it to behave as a single focus mode or a continual focus mode? I want it as continuous, so AF-C. That's what I have that set at. Again, AF mode, we talked about that already. Face detection I normally have off, but if I am taking a portrait, I will put that on. And I have a function button on the back of the camera where I could turn that on and off. And eye detection, you could choose auto, right eye, left eye, or off. Auto, it will always choose the eye closest the lens, and that's what I have it set at. But typically, I have face detection off, as I mentioned. Next is pre-autofocus. That means even if you have the camera at your side and you're not even thinking of taking a picture, the camera will always be trying to autofocus. Why you might want that on is because it tends to be faster focusing that way, but it will drain your battery. So I have mine off. Mine will only autofocus when I either have to press the shutter button or press in the AF-L button on the back of the camera. AF illuminator I have off, but in a dark situation I will turn that on to help me focus if I need to, but I usually have that off. Now the auto ISO settings, I have my default sensitivity set to 200, which is the lowest natural ISO that this camera will go. The maximum sensitivity to 6400, which is the maximum natural sensitivity that this camera will go, and the minimum shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. So this means when I'm in auto ISO, I have A set on the ISO button on the camera, that as long as I could achieve a shutter speed of faster than 1/250th of a second, the scene's bright enough, the default ISO will be 200. If the scene gets a little darker and the shutter speed would drop below 1/250th of a second, it will up the ISO up to 6400 so I could take the picture. So that's my auto ISO settings. Now, you can see image size is grayed out. That's because I only shoot RAW. If you want to shoot JPEG, I would recommend you shoot fine or fine and RAW. When that is chosen, then you could go and change your image size. And with that, I would recommend that you choose a 3:2 ratio. That's the same ratio as 35mm film. So that's more natural. If you're shooting movies, you might want to use 16:9 or something like that. But as I mentioned, for me, it doesn't matter because I only shoot RAW. Dynamic range doesn't matter again because I'm shooting RAW, but if you're shooting JPEG, you could choose Auto 100, 200, 400. That means that the dynamic range of an image is how much is really black and how much is really white. You might have an image that has a great dynamic range, some really bright parts, some really dark parts. If that's the case, you may want to go to 400%. That will help give you detail in the brightest parts of the image and in the darkest part of the image. I happen to have mine set at 100, but again, it doesn't matter because I'm shooting RAW, so it's not really applicable. Film simulation, again, this doesn't matter to me because I'm shooting RAW, but you could choose sepia, all these different black and white settings, Pro Negative, Classic Chrome, Astia, Velvia, Provia, or all these different settings for your JPEG image if you're shooting JPEG. Again, I don't shoot JPEG, so that's not applicable, but because I'm shooting RAW and I'm using Lightroom to process my images, all those film simulation choices are available in Lightroom, so I could add them in post if I so choose. Self-timer, this 2 seconds or 10 seconds, so if you want to press the shutter button and run around to get in the picture, you might want to set it to 10 seconds. If you're doing a macro shot and you don't want any movement at all, even when you're pressing the shutter button, you may want to put 2 seconds on. That way you could press the shutter button down and then the camera won't take the picture for 2 seconds, and that will allow the camera to stabilize from that moment you press the shutter down. Interval timer shooting, this is like time-lapse photography. This, if you're doing star trails, a lot of people like to do that. You might want to set it for an hour interval and have it take 60 or maybe 120 shots over that hour interval and star trails. So you could experiment with that. Again, I don't use that much at all. White balance, I have mine set to auto. You could, of course, have 3 custom settings. You could set it to like incandescent, fluorescent, stuff like that. I found auto works great. Because I'm shooting RAW, I could, again, adjust that in Lightroom. I could have all those choices available in Lightroom to choose. Now, color, sharpness, highlight tone, shadow tone, this is all applicable to the JPEG image you're creating. Since I'm not shooting JPEG, I don't have these set at all. Now, you could experiment if you're shooting JPEG by increasing your color a little bit, adding some sharpness, toning your highlights or toning your shadows, stuff like that. But again, because I'm shooting RAW, it's not applicable to me at all. Noise reduction, again, that's the same thing as if you're shooting in JPEG, how much noise reduction you're going to add to the image. Long exposure noise reduction, now, that's applicable whether you're shooting RAW or JPEG. If you're doing a relatively long exposure, a lot of times you'll get some sensor noise because the sensor is being energized for such a long period of time. And if you have long exposure noise reduction set to on, and let's say you're doing a 60-second exposure, you'll take that 60-second exposure, but then the camera will immediately take another 60-second exposure of a blank scene. And what it will do, it will use that blank black picture to determine where there is sensor noise. And then it will use that as a template to remove the sensor noise from the real image. The reason why I have mine set off is because I don't like to wait twice as long for a long exposure to be done. So if I'm doing a 60-second exposure, it would take 120 seconds, 2 minutes. I don't want to wait around. I have mine set to off, and any long exposure noise reduction I do happen to introduce into my image, I could remove with Lightroom or with Topaz Denoise. Fine, I don't need to do it in camera. So that's why I have mine set off. Lens Modulation Optimizer. This is a pretty cool feature. I have mine set to on. And most of you probably know that if you stop a lens down, most lenses, beyond f8, f11, you start to get an effect called diffraction, which means your picture won't be as crisp and well focused anymore. So if you're shooting f22, the diffraction will be so great that you'll lose a lot of detail, fine detail, because of this effect called diffraction. Well, if you're using the Fujifilm X-T1 with the Fujifilm lens and you have lens modulation optimizer on, software in the camera will actually correct for the diffraction. So you could go and stop down much more than you might be able to with a different camera. So might want to stop down to f/16 to get a lot of depth of field, and you could be fairly confident that you're going to get a very well focused, crisp image if you have lens modulation optimizer turned on, and that's why I have mine on. Now the next two settings are for the Q menu, and I'm not going to talk about those, and I'm going to do a separate video on the Q menu. And to tell you the truth, I don't really use the Q menu because, again, I shoot RAW. The Q menu comes in really handy if you are shooting JPEG, and you could quickly switch to different types of film simulations and bracketing and things like that. So I will cover that in a separate video. Mount adapter setting, if you're not using a Fujifilm lens, you're using a different lens from another manufacturer, you might have to use a mount to mount that lens on. So what's the setting of the mount, 50 millimeters or what? You could set that here. All I ever use is Fujifilm lens, so that's not applicable to me. Shoot without lens, again, if you're using that aftermarket lens, or not aftermarket, but another brand lens, and the camera might not know that that lens is attached. So you want that shoot without lens set to on so that when you press the shutter it will actually take a picture. But again, that's not applicable to me. All I use are Fujifilm lenses. Manual focus assist, I use peak with blue highlight on high, and that's, you can do a digital split image or just standard by looking and making sure that you have it focused, manually focused properly. To tell you the truth, digital split imaging doesn't work very well. I found focus peak highlight works well in blue because I like blue, so I use blue and it works well. AEAF lock mode, that is the two buttons on the back of the camera, the automatic exposure button and the automatic focus button. I have mine set to when pressing. You could also set those as an on-off switch. If you have them set as an on-off switch, you could point your camera at a scene, let's say, press in the AE lock button and gain an exposure. And if you have it set as an on-off switch, it'll hold that exposure. And it will keep holding the exposure even if you press in the shutter button and start taking pictures. It will always hold that exposure. It won't change until you press it again and turn it off. Same thing with the focus button, the AF-L button. If you focus on a spot, you have it set as an on-off switch. It'll focus on that spot, hold that focus on that spot. Even when you press the shutter button and keep taking pictures, it will not try to focus again. It'll hold that original focus that you used. I would prefer to have it as pressing because, to tell you the truth, I often forget to turn it off if I turn it on. So I have mine set, both those buttons set to, as I press them, it's going to gain exposure or focus, and then I have to keep holding it in when I press in the shutter button. The AF lock mode, that is the AF-L button on the back of the camera. When you press that in, are you just going to focus lock, or are you going to lock in exposure as well? I have mine only focusing. That's all I want it to do. I don't want it to lock in exposure as well. So that's how I have mine set. Flash mode, you have these different flash modes. You could have force flash, which is just regular flashes. Slow synchro, if you have a scene, environmental portrait or maybe a lifestyle shot, and you really want the land around the person to be properly exposed, you might have to use a slower shutter speed. And if you would set this to slow synchro then, and the flash will try to balance its light with the existing light in the scene. And that comes in really handy for that type of application. Second curtain sync, If you have something moving through the frame, let's say a person riding a bike through the frame, but you're going to use a flash with a long exposure, they call this dragging the shutter. What you would do is you want second current sync, because that means that the flash will fire at the end of the exposure, not at the beginning. If you use force flash or slow synchro, it flashes at the beginning of the exposure. That means if a person is riding a bike, they'd be solid at the beginning and blurred going toward the right if they were moving left to right. That doesn't look natural. You would rather have them blurred than solid, and that's what second current sync will do. Commander, if you're using external flashes, this flash that's on this camera will control those other flashes, tell them how to flash exposure and stuff like that. I never use that. I don't really use external flashes with this camera. Or suppress flash, you're just going to turn flash off. I have mine set to force mode. Flash compensation, I do have this set on a function button on the back of the camera so I could quickly access this. There are times where I want to add or add some flash compensation, be it positive or negative. Red eye removal I have set to off. You could have that set on if you want the camera to remove any red eyes that might happen because of the flash. Movie setup. I don't use my X-T1 for movies, but if I did, I do have the settings. I want 19 by 20 by 1080 HD picture at 60 frames per second, which is pretty much the maximum values for a movie, the highest quality. The mic level adjustments, I have mine set to 3. And the mic remote release, that is on the side of the camera, there is a jack. I have mine set to microphone. But if I'm shooting a macro and I want to use a wired remote to fire the shutter, I would have to go here and change this to remote. Then that jack works as a wired remote release. So that's where you would do that there. The next, you can see IS mode is grayed out. That is if you are using a lens with image stabilization. I happen to have a 23mm lens on here that does not have image stabilization. But if you are, that will be active. And you could have the IS mode set to one of two different things. One is that the camera will be continually, in the lens, will continually try to stabilize the image. Even if you have the camera at your side and you're walking around, the lens will always be trying to stabilize the image. The other selection is it will only try to stabilize the image when you half press the shutter button. And I do have one lens that has image stabilization, and when I use it, I have it set so that it will only attempt to stabilize the scene when I half press the shutter. That saves on battery power. If you have it so that it's always trying to stabilize the scene, you're going to drain your battery pretty quickly. Now, aperture setting, you can see, is grayed out. That is if you're using a lens without an aperture ring. All my lenses happen to have aperture rings, but if you were using one without, that is how the command dial reacts to change the aperture. That's how you would use that setting. Shutter type, I tend to always use mechanical, well, not always, but I tend to use mechanical shutter more. I do have a function button on the camera set so I could quickly change this. I will use electronic shutter if I need an absolutely silent shutter. I will use electronic shutter. There are some other advantages to using the electronic shutter. You could use, I think it goes up to 1/32,000th of a second shutter speed if you use an electronic shutter, something like that. But there are some disadvantages to the electronic shutter. If you have something moving through the frame, it usually will get distorted with an electronic shutter, and you need to use a mechanical shutter. So I almost always use mechanical shutter, but if I ever need an absolutely silent shutter and nothing is really moving through the frame, I will switch to an electronic shutter. AF plus MF, that means that when I am focusing, half pressing the shutter button in, that I could manually focus now by just turning the ring on the lens. So I can autofocus, I have it set on, and I could then just manually focus, touch up the focus by keeping my finger half pressed on the shutter and spinning the ring on the lens to manually focus. You could set that to off so that you don't accidentally mess up your focus. So you could set it to off. I have mine set to on. Interlock the spot AE and focus area. I have mine set to on. That is when you're using spot focusing. Wherever I have that spot is the spot that the camera is going to use for exposure as well. To me, I like that because even if I have, let's say, a subject on the far left of the frame and I move my focus area to the far left, focus on that subject on the far left, it would make sense that I want that subject properly exposed. So it will use that spot on the far left for exposure as well. Now we're back. We're done with the shooting menu. Now we're going to jump down real quick into the setup menu. Okay, a lot of the setup menu is self-explanatory. Date and time, we could set the date and time. Time difference if I'm traveling and I have my time set for East Coast time because I live on the East Coast of the United States, but I'm traveling, let's say, to the West Coast. I could put in a 3-hour time difference so my images are time-stamped correctly. Language, I use English. Reset, this will reset all the settings to their factory defaults. Sound and flash off. I typically will have this off. I don't like the camera to make any noise when I'm taking pictures. If I use a flash though, I will have to put that to on. Sound setup. When I do use sound, I will have the operation volume as low as possible. I will have the shutter volume off. I don't really need the shutter to make any noise. And the shutter sound, if I did, you could pick different sounds for your shutter to make. Playback volume, if you did a video and you're playing it back in your camera, that's how loud the playback volume will be. And I don't really make videos with this camera, so that really isn't applicable to me. Screen setup, this is the actual screen itself. Image display, that means chimping. After you take a picture, do you look at the back of your camera to see how the picture came out, also known as chimping? I don't, so I have it set to off. If you do, you could turn it on. Just be aware that you will run down your batteries quicker if you chimp, so that is the main reason why I have mine off. EVF, auto rotate display, that means when you're looking through the electronic viewfinder and you spin the camera to take a portrait orientated shot, the display will spin with me so that it will automatically rotate. I have mine set to on. Preview, the exposure and the white balance in manual mode. I turn this on and off a lot. Right now I have it on. That means when I look through the viewfinder or I look at the back of the camera, I will be viewing what the exposure should look like and what the white balance should look like. When I will turn it off, as if it's a dark scene I'm photographing inside using a flash, because it's so dark and the camera doesn't necessarily know that I'm using a flash, particularly maybe an off-camera flash. So when I look through the viewfinder or at the back of the camera, it'll be very, very dark. It'll be probably black. So I will turn that off. That way the viewfinder will just show me a lit kind of scene so that I could see, I could focus, I could compose and take the shot. So I typically will leave that on most of the time, but if I'm using a flash, I will turn that off. EVF brightness, this is the electronic viewfinder brightness. I leave these at the default settings for brightness, color. LCD brightness, I leave that at the default setting too for brightness and color. Preview picture effect, I have that on, although I never use it. Remember the different picture effects you could do? That was low key, high key, toy, camera, that stuff. You could preview that effect in the viewfinder or on the back LCD if you have this set to on. Framing guideline, I use a 9 grid, or grid 9 as they say in this menu. That's typical rule of thirds spacing. That's what I like to use because I often compose to rule of thirds. If you prefer a grid 24, or if you're maybe making movies with the camera, you may prefer HD framing. Again, I prefer the grid 9. Auto rotate playback, that means when you're looking at your images, if you took any vertical images, they'll automatically be rotated in the viewfinder or in the back LCD so that you don't have to spin the camera to view them. Background color, I have mine set to blue only because I like blue, so that's why mine is blue. Focus check, if you're manually focusing and, well, technically if you're auto-focusing and then you decide to manually focus, you start spinning your uh, focus ring on the lens. The display will shift so that you could better view the focus and make sure that you're focusing properly. I have that set to on. Focus scale units, I use feet, and display custom settings. This is on the back LCD panel what is being displayed as you're taking shots, and through the EVF too. I have everything checked. I like to see everything: histogram, my autofocus distance, manual focus distance, electronic level, all of it. If you don't need any of that, you never use the histogram, you might want to turn that off. That will make the back display and the EVF less cluttered if you turn it off. So as I mentioned, I have all those checked, so they're always turned on. The next is the button dial settings, the function buttons on the back of the camera. I have the front function button for my shutter. Remember I mentioned that I often switch between mechanical and electronic shutter. I could quickly access that menu item with that front function button. The top function button I have for Wi-Fi when I want to connect to my smartphone app, or if I'm connecting to an Instax printer, I use that function button too. This is the focus type of focus mode I'm using, whether it's spot or whatever. I could quickly access it with function button 3. Function button 4 is for face detection, and so I could quickly access that and turn it on. The function button 5 is for my ISO settings, auto ISO, so I could quickly change that if I want to. And function button 6 is my actual focus focus spot or focus area, so I could change its size or location where I'm focusing, and that's how I have my function button set. Command dial settings, that is, you could have the front command dial adjust shutter speed and the rear command dial adjust your aperture, and that's the way I have it set up. Or you could reverse it, have the front command dial do your f-stop or aperture, and the rear the rear button do your shutter speed. As I mentioned, I use shutter speed to the front, f-stop to the back. Selector button setting, that's those function buttons that I mentioned earlier. You could use those if you don't want to use them as function buttons. You could use those to move your focus spot around instead. I prefer to use them as function buttons, so I have them set as function buttons. The AE-L and AF-L buttons, I have them set to do as they say, meaning the AE-L and AFL are what they are. You could swap them if you prefer to have the AFL act as your AEL and the AFL effect as your AEL, whatever. You could just swap them. I don't know why you might want to do that, but if you do, you could do that. And that's all the button dial settings. Next is the ISO dial settings. H1 on your ISO dial, I have it set to do 12,800, and H2 25,600. To tell you the truth, I never use it. I never go up that high with my ISO. Focus ring, I have it just working counterclockwise to focus in. That's the way I do it. So you could switch it so it goes counterclockwise if you so choose. Power management, this is kind of important. Auto power off 2 minutes, so if I'm not touching the camera, it'll power off in 2 minutes. And I have high performance on. With high performance, it tends to focus a little faster, and it tends to just operate a lot quicker. The downside of high performance being on is that you will drain your battery a little faster. I like that trade-off, so I have high performance on. It particularly will help focus. It focuses a lot faster. Sensor cleaning, you could just do a sensor clean anytime you want by clicking OK there, and it will clean the sensor. And then what the camera will do when you turn it off and on. I have it so that when I turn the camera off, it cleans the sensor. When I turn it on, it does not. The reason being is I often will turn the camera on to take a shot right away, very quickly, and I don't want to be held up because it's cleaning the sensor. So I have it only cleaning the sensor when I turn it off. Save data setup. This is now like when you're taking a picture, is it going to continually increment the frame numbers, or is it going to renew numbers, go back and use old numbers? I have it so it's always continually incrementing the numbers. Save original image, I have that off. That is if you used red eye reduction in one of those earlier shooting menu choices. You could have it so it will save the original image as well as the image with the red eye eliminated. So you'd actually be saving two images. The original image of the person with red eyes and the image with the red eyes removed. I don't use red eye reduction, so I have it off. It doesn't even matter to me. Edit file name. This is the actual files as they're saved. If I'm shooting sRGB, which I always do, my raw files begin with DSCF. If I did shoot some images with Adobe RGB, they'd be DSCF. Doesn't really matter to me, to tell you the truth. I do use the sRGB color space. You could use the Adobe RGB color space instead if you so choose. The connection settings, those are the Wi-Fi settings. I leave those as they are. Generally, you could go in if you're installing an Instax printer, you would set it up there. I never tether the camera to my computer, so I really don't need it for that. Geotagging with the smartphone app, so I could actually put the GPS coordinates as I take images. Sometimes I do that, and you could all do that through that menu. Edit, save, quick menu. This is again the quick menu, which I'll be doing a separate video on. USB mode is auto. That's just if you're hooking up to your computer, it will automatically make the connection, different types of connections, MTP, PTP, stuff like that. I never tether, so it really doesn't matter. That's not anything to do with me. Lock, if you don't want to accidentally change specific settings, you could go here and lock it. So you go to function selection, you could choose what setting. You never want to switch your ISO or your shutter speed or your drive dial, things like that. You just don't want to accidentally switch them. If you find you're always accidentally hitting your aperture and you always want to shoot at f8, you would check that box there, and then you would go back to lock setting and lock it, and then it would never change. I never lock anything, so because I'm always switching, so it doesn't matter to me. And the very last choice is format. That's to format your memory card, and it's as simple as that. You can just automatically go to that menu choice, format your SD card, and you're ready to shoot. So that's it. That's all the menu choices on the Fujifilm X-T1. I hope that that made sense and that helps those of you that might be wondered what some of those settings actually did. If I know I went very quickly, so if I wasn't clear on anything, please leave a comment below and I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have. Also, because I went so quickly, maybe I made a mistake, and if I did, feel free to correct me below so we could make sure that the correct information is getting out to everyone. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for watching my videos. I truly do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you guys soon.